Policy debates about welfare often center on questions of fairness. What level of inequality is acceptable, and which individuals are deserving of redistribution? Different people may have different answers to these questions, leading to different policy preferences. But suppose we all agreed in theory on what is fair and what is not. There could still be disagreement over the optimal policy because, in practice, deservingness may depend on unobservable characteristics, leaving decision-makers reliant on indirect and imperfect indicators. In this kind of second-best situation, an individual's preferred policy will reflect their willingness to trade off two kinds of mistakes: giving some individuals more than they deserve versus giving others less than they deserve. Consider unemployment benefits. Unemployment compensation is intended for those who are involuntarily unemployed. These are individuals who are unable to find employment despite being willing and able to work. These conditions are not clearly observable, so most unemployment programs impose eligibility requirements to proxy for them. If these requirements are strict, some involuntarily unemployed may fail to meet them, while if they are loose, some voluntarily unemployed may satisfy them. In other words, the strictness of these criteria reflects a trade-off between false positives and false negatives. How do people generally balance this trade-off? The authors explore this using a large-scale experimental study encompassing 26,500 participants recruited in the US and Norway. These countries represent extremes among OECD countries with respect to income inequality and differ dramatically in the generosity of their welfare states. In the paper's main experiment, participants act as third-party spectators and decide whether to pay a worker who has filed a claim for compensation. Workers were recruited via an online labor market platform and randomly given an offer of work or not. Those who received an offer and completed the task were paid $6, while those who were not offered work were entitled to a compensation of $4. Those who received an offer of work but declined it were not entitled to the compensation. However, all workers who had not worked could file a claim. They were told a third party would decide whether their claim should be paid, and this third party might not know whether the claim was false or correct. So someone who filed a false claim might receive the compensation, while someone who filed a correct claim might not. Workers who filed a claim were organized into groups that differed in the share who made a false claim. Here, for example, the probability that a randomly drawn worker had filed a false claim was 75%. Spectators were matched with a worker randomly drawn from one of the 5 groups, informed of the probability that the worker had filed a false claim, and then chose whether to pay the claim or not. The idea is to distinguish between 3 kinds of spectators: those who are more concerned with false negatives than with false positives, those who are more concerned with false positives, and those with symmetric preferences. When it is equally likely that a claim is false or correct, a symmetric spectator is indifferent between paying the claim or not. A false negative averse spectator prefers to pay the claim, and a false positive averse spectator prefers not to pay the claim. This figure provides an overview of the results. The y-axis shows the share of spectators who chose to pay the claim in each of the 5 treatment groups. For example, 90.2% of spectators pay when there is 0 chance of a false claim, and only 9.7% pay when there is a 100% chance of a false claim. Note 2 findings. First, the share of spectators choosing to pay falls by 10.4 percentage points when moving from a 0 to 25% probability of a false claim. This rules out the possibility that all spectators have symmetric preferences. Those who weigh false positives and false negatives equally will always pay if the probability of a false claim is less than 50%. Second, the majority of spectators, or around 3/4, choose to pay when there is a 50% chance of a false claim. This indicates that significantly more people are more concerned with false negatives than with false positives. Estimates show that the majority of spectators are false negative averse, and less than a third are false positive averse. These patterns are similar between the US and Norway, but interesting differences emerge when we look at the strength of people's preferences. The majority of people in both countries have strong preferences for avoiding one of these mistakes. They are either strongly false positive averse or strongly false negative averse. But while there is a larger share of strongly false positive averse spectators in the US than in Norway, there is a larger share of strongly false negative averse spectators in Norway than in the US. This suggests that the greater support for generous welfare institutions in Norway may reflect not only that Norwegians and Americans have different views on fairness, but also that Norwegians tend to be more false negative averse than Americans. Consistent with this, second-best fairness preferences are related to political affiliation and policy attitudes. Among participants in this paper's experiment, right-wing spectators are more likely to be strongly false positive averse than non-right-wing spectators, and false negative averse spectators are more supportive of redistributive policies than false positive averse spectators. And so, this paper argues that second-best fairness preferences are an important factor in people's attitudes toward welfare and redistribution. Beyond the policy realm, this trade-off may also shape decision-making in other important contexts, such as judicial cases. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. This includes research on fairness preferences, the foundations of political attitudes, and international differences in attitudes toward inequality and redistribution.